Hi, I'm Nick Hilton of The Town That Didn't Stare, and I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
Now, if I were to say that we're going to produce a podcast focused on the small town where I live, what do you think the reaction of MetaPod listeners would be, Wendy?
You got any more episodes about music and raves coming?
Well, actually we do, but...
All right, just joking. Okay, you're doing a podcast about a small town. My reaction would be, oh yeah, well, what's so interesting about your town, Kev?
Well, there's actually nothing really at all, actually. But the point is that's not at all the case with the podcast featured on this week's MetaPod, which is called The Town That Didn't Stare.
Well, maybe that town is in a different league to where you live, Kevin. One of the most well-known classic rock groups of the 70s lived in that town. I mean, who lives in your town?
An assortment of various folk, but I suppose the one that most people reference a lot is Russell Brand, who went to a college here. So kind of there, I'm sticking my finger up at you as we speak.
Okay, well, keep us posted on how that podcast develops. In the meantime, let's get back to this other town and other podcast. We're talking about the town of East Grinstead in England, and the podcast about it, The Town That Didn't Stare. The podcast has been equated to Britain's Twin Peaks, and to that I would add Led Zeppelin, Scientologists, Mormons, Rosicrucians, and other stuff on the periphery.
That's right. As the podcast creator and narrator Nick Hilton says, East Grinstead is also a nexus for ley lines and druids, being exactly on the prime meridian down from Greenwich in London. It was also an early settlement for Saxons, and get this, is arguably Britain's most haunted town. So the story is interesting to anyone with even the slightest curiosity in small towns and how they can become homes to a collection of unique and strange folk.
And aside from exploring the history of East Grinstead, the podcast dips into things like cognitive bias in the internet, knowledge bubbles, and rabbit holes. There's also guinea pigs and 80s synth, but we'll keep quiet on those parts and let listeners discover on their own.
Yeah, and if the bizarre-sounding world of East Grinstead hasn't intrigued you yet, there's Nick's skill in narration. He has a pretty clever turn of phrase, I think, telling an informative yet entertaining story with an occasional deadpan wink. That's if, let's face it, a voice can actually wink, but well, you know what I mean. So let's hear it from Nick.
Yes, wink. Start the tape. Hello, Nick, and welcome to MetaPod. I'm very happy to have you here to talk about your podcast, The Town That Didn't Stare, which is a 6-episode story of the town of East Grinstead in England. Welcome.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks for having me.
Now, you've independently written, edited, and produced The Town That Didn't Stare, and I understand you've also distributed it through your own independent podcast network. Would you maybe kick off by telling us a little bit about the podcast itself, who its main protagonist is, and why you wanted to work on The Town That Didn't Stare?
So as I say, I guess in the first paragraph of the podcast have paragraphs, the protagonist is actually a town rather than a person. It's a little town in Sussex called East Grinstead, which is known to quite a lot of British people as this kind of place where alternative religions have convened over the years: Scientologists, Mormons, Opus Dei, Rosicrucians, etc. So it's kind of has a sort of interesting place in the British cultural psyche, but I think it's still relatively obscure. That it was sufficiently obscure that I felt like people would get something out of discovering this anew, even though to me it seems like something that everyone I know knows. So that was the kind of the protagonist. That's the story. I just thought, I wonder if I can tell this story over a sequence of episodes, kind of delve into various different cultures and little sub-histories, and then maybe come together, kind of make it all coalesce into a broader point about, I don't know, about our natural pattern-seeking behavior. And I also think that kind of psychogeography and looking at the way towns develop their own identities is kind of something that's interesting to me in and of itself. So I kind of knew it was something I vaguely wanted to do. I'd written about it for Vice, and contextually I grew up very near the town and went to school in the town. So I had that kind of, it was something I felt I could do. And I'd approached a, quite famous singer-songwriter who from the town 18 months, 2 years ago, something like that. And we'd had some chats about developing quite a different version of this podcast. If for various reasons it just fizzled out, I think neither of us had the time. The idea then was that we would put together a pitch probably for the BBC, something like that, with her presenting and me pulling the technical strings. But then lockdown occurred, and I suddenly had no social life, nothing, no commitments there taking up any time. So I
sorry to laugh.
thought that we all had the same experience, I guess, where suddenly we had all this time on our hands, and I there were only so many box sets to binge. I watched quite a lot of television in normal times. I didn't need to watch much more, so I thought this is a good opportunity for me to do something a bit like off my own, make something that feels like I'm putting my own stamp on it, because most of the work I do is kind of corporate or client editorial work.
You had an interest in documentary to begin with, is that correct?
Well, I guess a lot of people have an interest in documentaries. I mean, I've always liked documentaries. I'm not uniquely fascinated by it, and I hadn't done something in this format before, and it was something that quite often people would come to me and say, either clients would come or like people who just are like, would your production company be interested in this documentary? And I would be like, I don't have any experience with documentaries. I do mainly, interviews and roundtables and, predominantly current affairs stuff. So I didn't really have any particular knowledge of it, other than that I listened to a lot of podcast documentaries, and it's in a way it's much closer to normal feature journalism, documentary podcasting. The interview podcast is actually kind of a weird format. It's like if you were to put it in print, it would be this sort of Q&A format that's kind of gone out of fashion, whereas the documentary format felt to me much closer to feature writing, which I'm quite comfortable with, and read a lot even if I'm not writing very much of it at the moment.
So there wasn't a documentary film or other podcast that inspired you or influenced the format that you followed?
It's difficult. I'm reluctant to, because I'm sure that my brain was doing all sorts of things in terms of plagiarizing. And I had certainly listened to John Ronson's podcast, The Butterfly Effect, after I had started writing, but before I had started making. And then actually I was listening to the audiobook of his novel, of his book, The Psychopath Test, during while I was making it, which sort of explains why John Ronson appears as a character in the podcast. But that's probably, the Butterfly Test is probably the closest that there is to something which is a precedent or an antecedent for my podcast, because it has this very discursive style, kind of spins off down various things, and it takes a kind of story. It's actually, subsequently I've also listened to the Rabbit Hole from the New York Times, which does a sort of similar thing of sort of falling down the rabbit hole and being like, if you pull at one thread, watch as the whole sweater comes unraveled. So yeah, that's probably the closest there was to something that impressed itself upon the making of this show.
And I grew up in Kent, which, as you know, is a neighbouring county of Sussex. And I have no idea why, but, in that kind of teenage boy kid thing where you change the names of things, I always knew of East Grinstead as East Grinstead. And I can't remember why.
Yeah.
It was just, that was the name of the town. And I don't think it was certainly nicer than the town that I grew up in, which was Chatham. So it was, for those of you that know Chatham, they'll know what I mean. But it's interesting that the town there was something about it, because one, it got this odd name from people that were in the neighbouring counties. But I wondered, when did you said you grew up nearby, when did you kind of get a sense that there were things about it that did kind of coalesce into making it unusual, if that's the word to use at the moment?
Well, where I grew up was sort of on the road between East Grinstead, as you would call it, and Crawley, which is one of the most maligned towns it sort of has Chatham levels of the way it's treated by the public. So, and Crawley is often called Creepy Crawley, and I wonder whether the proximity of Crawley to East Grinstead made it kind of East Grinstead, Creepy Crawley.
Is that not where Robert Smith and the Cure started?
Exactly. It's a nice thing for it to be known for. It's mainly known for being in this country one of the 1946 designate new towns, or these kind of concrete slabs. Anyway, so that might explain why you wanted to refashion the name. I went to school there, and the funny thing is that East Grinstead has this kind of weird history, and then it has this kind of amazing history of during the Second World War, where it was kind of a really world-class revolutionary burns unit for RAF servicemen, and they formed this thing called the Guinea Pig Club, which is it's just anyone who has any interest in like military history, particularly RAF history, knows the guinea pigs, because it's an incredible story, and it's genuinely important in terms of the way that burns were being treated at that time and the way that patients were rehabilitated. But it's funny because even that I wasn't taught at school, and I would have thought that would be the first thing that, a history class at school in East Grinstead wants to teach its students. So in a way, I had a kind of a totally ahistorical perspective on the town. But I played rugby at the rugby club there in East Grinstead, which is right next to St. Hill. And I guess that probably my father would tell me about the Scientologists there when I was sort of 8 or 9. And he claims that he took me to a fete there, because they occasionally do open days where they had little kind of fates for the and I'd like this to be true. I would have included it in the podcast if I was convinced it was true, but I have no memory of it, and he's known to exaggerate. So that was kind of when the Scientologists were definitely the first people I noticed. But you can't help but notice the Mormon temple, which is just off the road, and it's vast, and St. Hill is kind of set back. You can't really see anything from the road, which is where the Scientologists are. Whereas the Mormon temple in Lingfield it's kind of amazing looking. It's like nothing else in kind of UK architecture. So I knew that was there, but I think probably I was a teenager when I put 2 and 2 together and realized that was a Latter-day Saints thing. And then Opus Dei, when I read the Da Vinci Code, I must have Googled Opus Dei and found out that they were there too. And so I don't know. It was all over a process, but I don't think there's no sign when you come into East Grinstead saying Scientologists this way, Mormons this way, self-flagellating Catholics that way.
No, the interesting thing, when I said this to Wendy when I first started listening to the first episode, or the intro episode, and this goes to the main question really, which is, you talked about putting your stamp on the podcast. In the first couple of minutes of listening to it, I doubted myself a little bit, because all I could think of, and I say this very respectfully, is this some kind of League of Gentlemen type thing? And you'll remember the League of Gentlemen, and our UK listeners will as well, which was a slightly strange parody of a small town that has lots of odd things that go on it. And the way you do that narrative in the first that kind of preview episode, I was thinking, oh, this is a parody thing. This is almost comedy. So is your stamp that you put on it to make light, almost, if that's the right word, of this disparate group of odd things and odd happenings that take place there? Or was that unintentional?
I hope it was intentional. I don't think I would ever do a super serious expose. The subject doesn't treat itself to and equally I don't think I would have wanted to do a podcast that was like a comedy podcast, because I'm not a comedian. So I kind of wanted to do something that was lighthearted and funny and weird, and as every review of it has used the word arch, which it was not something I did consciously, but apparently that seems to be the consensus. So I guess I had referred to it in a lot of kind of pitch documents and briefs and stuff like that as Britain's Twin Peaks, which I guess is a more American cultural version of the League of Gentlemen. But yeah, there's definitely something about the way that the narrative, I wanted the narrative to be catchy, and it is more catchy if you treat it as this town where There's a sort of like bubbling, mysterious things going on. And I have had people who thought that, certainly from the trailer, a lot of people thought it was fiction.
But there are moments that I listen to most of the podcasts that I do when I'm walking the dog, and there were many moments where I laughed out loud, and I wonder whether that was your kind of turn of phrase, whether you've just got this slight inflection in your voice that is slightly sarcastic when you're talking about things, and I wonder whether that was intentional to make it quite light in places, because it is, I think.
But I'm not happy with leading you up the garden path, pretending that I have some great solution to this question, and then revealing, as Ian did, that it's largely just coincidence. It feels beneath me, and deliberately frustrating, like when you see a pop-up saying that you'll never believe what some obscure 90s celebrity looks like now, and then you click and click and click, battling viruses and pornography, and at the end of it, you still don't know what that obscure 90s celebrity looks like now. Perhaps you never will.
Yeah. I mean, it is supposed to be funny. I mean, I'm not the person to judge the success or not of that, but it's certainly not supposed to be. I would have written it very differently if I was trying to be deeply respectful of the town or trying to expose any great truths. So yeah, it's supposed to be funny, and I think a lot of the interviewees sort of are funny, sometimes intentionally. You know, there's a moment where one of my interviewees, he talks about. I can't remember. He's got us making a stone circle, and I lost it during the interview because he was talking about how he realized that everyone standing around the stone circle, the spirit of the Ashdown Forest had imbued them, and they'd sort of come to represent the different characters from Winnie the Pooh. And he was sort of being like, and my mate Terry was Eeyore, classic Eeyore. Brian was Tigger, you know, and it was just, there was something, so the seriousness and the absurdity of it was what got me. And there's a lot of that kind of the juxtaposition of what is quite serious and what is quite absurd that runs through it.
Has the town been involved with the podcast at any point? Have they utilized it for anything? Do you think that they will?
East Grinstead is not a tiny town, and it is quite famous, and it is only 50 minutes on the train from London, and it has its own museum, and you know, it has 40,000 people in it. So I don't think they needed my podcast, but I've received a lot of emails and letters from people who've listened to it in the town. I think it's been well received in the town, because I think, and this happened during the process of releasing it, the Daily Mail did a big splash on the town, spun off the back of the podcast. They basically ripped the podcast for quotes and then created a kind of a town. The headline was "The Town That Went Sex Mad," which is a good headline, but it's exactly the stuff that the town doesn't like. It doesn't like being treated as really weird. It doesn't like people forgetting about the Guinea Pig Club, etc. I think generally the people who would be skeptical about that sort of coverage have been quite pro. I've not received any criticism from anyone in the town, which is pretty rare for these things, because they are cautious about specifically outsiders kind of coming in and being like, this is the freaky cults town, because it doesn't represent their lives at all for most people who go there, you know, who can spend decades living there without encountering anyone from any sect or cult.
So it's unlikely the town would utilize it to generate more tourism or something like that.
Well, the town museum is kind of, it's a great little museum. You know, not every town has a nice kind of modern museum. It doesn't have a single reference to like the Ron Hubbard living there and the Scientologists and all the stuff that makes East Grinstead famous for a lot of people. It's all about, you know, I think they do some of the kind of the early prehistory stuff that I do in the podcast, and then they go straight on to World War II. And so I actually asked them when I was interviewing Jonathan Parrott, who kind of runs the museum, and said, you know, why don't you guys have a Scientology exhibit in the museum? And he was like, well, we haven't had any bequests. We're mainly left stuff by people who've died, and no one has given us. But I also think that there's probably a degree of pressure from the governance of the museum that this is a museum about the town, and it's a museum about the history that they're proud of. But like East Grinstead is the perfect place to locate like a museum of cults, a museum of British alternative religion or something like that, which would be a genuine tourist attraction because it is close to London. There is other stuff to do around there, and I don't think that's what they're interested in.
And have you a sense of the feedback from people not familiar with the town at all who've listened to the podcast? Are they interested in this town, or outside of the UK, what has the feedback been?
I mean, I hope so. The vast majority of my listeners have been in the UK. I'd love it to have been listened to in America. I think it would be of interest to American listeners, but I haven't been able to tap that market really at all. So, I mean, people in East Grinstead send me emails about it a couple of times a week, which is very nice. People outside of East Grinstead, I don't know. I get feedback from, my friends and peers, and, it's been reviewed quite a lot. And there's obviously the terrifying Apple reviews and stuff like that. But I don't know. It's quite hard to judge whether it's really resonated. When I first told people I know that I was planning to do it, a lot of people who knew the town were like, no one will be interested in East Grinstead. And I think the level of press attention, if nothing else, has probably proved that wrong. But I also don't have like an empirical measurement for saying people outside East Grinstead have been really fascinated by this story. I hope so, but I can't measure it.
It's interesting. I mean, the town I live in, Bishop Stortford, there are lots of different things going on. I mean, it doesn't have the level of East Grinstead in terms of, there's a Scientology centre and all those kind of things. But maybe there is something often quite peculiar about some of the smaller sub 30,000 people towns around the UK that, you could actually pull together something like a podcast that you've created just based because so many of these towns do have little stories.
Yeah, I think so. And that's what I said in kind of the concluding episode of the podcast is sort of about the way that to some extent we sort of self-deceive to believe there's a pattern where there's not, because a lot of the stories about East Grinstead basically incorporate things that are neighbouring to East Grinstead into East Grinstead in order to make it a neater package. I definitely think that, I mean, part of the idea of the series is to kind of prove that little towns in Britain have kind of interesting and amazing histories. But I think that you could scratch at most towns. And in a way, it would be kind of an interesting exercise to take the most, bland little kind of town of 10, 20,000 people and just kind of see if there's, these stories. And I think mostly you could come up with something to make. And so, I don't think it's only East Grinstead that has a story worth telling. But it's just the story that I knew.
What did you leave out? Because, there's the Scientology, but there's the Guinea Pig Club, which I think was terrific. That particular episode was great. And we'll come to the very last episode later on in the interview, because I think that was the best episode just because it explored some really interesting themes. But was there any other things that you discovered along the way or that you knew that you just didn't manage to put into an episode as a broad theme?
Well, it speaks to the resource scarcity that I actually kept an enormous amount of. I wasn't cutting things left and right because I didn't have a huge amount, and I didn't have all the time and energy in the world to spend on it. There are definitely more alternative religions. The fact that I only brought the Mormons in into the Scientology episode, which will piss them off, but such is life. I didn't give them a kind of fair hearing because the history of Mormonism in the UK is really interesting. The history of Mormonism in the UK is a story that actually belongs to Preston, really, bizarrely, which is where the first temple was, which is where they kind of the community, when they arrived at Liverpool from the US, kind of settled. I treated it more as kind of why it was interesting that this was being built at exactly the time that Ron Hubbard was setting up a camp in East Grinstead. There are other alternative religions, the Rosicrucians. The difficulty with the Rosicrucians is that they don't have a significant presence in the town these days to make it really interesting. The anthroposophists, I could have talked a lot more about. I've mentioned them only kind of briefly in passing, and the Steiner School in Forest Row. So that there were more religions that I could go through, but I didn't want it to just become about a story, a show where episode by episode I found another religion to sort of do. I mean, Scientology, there's a lot of meat to that story. Yeah. People know the basics of Scientology, and so I could sort of do a twist on that. Whereas, even with Mormonism in this country, you have to set out the kind of the basics of what the religion is, where it was founded, how it arrived in the UK, and that sort of thing. And I just felt like I would get sucked into something I didn't think was going to be so interesting. So I wanted to get kind of Scientology, and then I kind of confected to some extent this druidical presence because I thought it was so interesting, and the kind of the ley lines and the spirit energy stuff. But yeah, I could have done more alternative religion stuff. I can't really think of anything else I particularly left out, but probably I did.
A question about, I guess, extending the reach of the podcast. You mentioned maybe getting this into the US. And I think you've written on Medium as well about you might work with influencers if you did this again, or maybe I misunderstood that. I think you talk about utilizing influencers to get to niche audiences, I suppose. What are your thoughts on influencers in the podcast world?
Well, look, I come from I'm kind of an old, I'm in my late 20s, but I'm kind of an old school podcaster in many ways, in that I'm very suspicious of the BBC and Spotify and all the people who pump a lot of money into it. And I think it's sort of slightly ruined the, what made podcasting great and what made podcasting an exciting medium for independent broadcasters and publishers. And I have watched as kind of year on year, fewer podcasts that go on to kind of greatness and lots of people listening to them are from independent publishers. I think that's a real shame. And I've also watched, and this year has been, murderously bad for it, as more and more celebrities dominate the podcast market, and the fact they've all been stuck at home and just seemingly unable to just occupy themselves for like 6 months without taking all my business has really just exacerbated it. So I'm very skeptical of like influences in podcast culture. And I'm very disappointed when, production companies, a lot of production companies in this country are sort of like vassal operations to the BBC. And so, they're part of the larger problems anyway. But I'm always a bit disappointed when podcast companies kind of very excitedly announce that they're making X YouTuber or Y Twitch streamer's new podcast. Because I know, the point there is not to make a good podcast. The point there is to make a podcast that a lot of people listen to. But it does offer something to your slate and network of podcasts if you have within your stall the ability to kind of harness this network of recommendations of people to push. The reality is it's, for a podcast like mine, it would have been, prohibitively expensive to buy an endorsement from various influencers. But if I was making their podcast and, it was part of the agreed deal, etc., that they would promote podcasts within the network or from the same publisher, that would make it worthwhile. It was more of a kind of stray observation, I guess, in that piece, that conventional advertising for podcasts is really bad. The conversion rate is really bad. It's really expensive. And I think that unless you're willing to put together like a marketing budget that is, tens of thousands of pounds, there's not a great deal that you can do. So I guess it was just a way of thinking more creatively about the idea of like endorsements and referrals. And, I when I released this podcast, various people that I know from journalism, from my client editorial work, tweeted out about it. Now, they're not influencers in the same way that people whose sole job is to basically shill products is. But, that was kind of way that I kind of started to get the show to get a bit of momentum. So I kind of think that maybe on a grander scale that would have been useful. But I don't have a great solution to how to do that other than, make podcasts for them.
Did you consider tapping into the Led Zeppelin fan base?
Yeah, of course I did. And I'm sure I put in.
You still can, I think.
Maybe I should. Maybe I should. It's very. I think they're mentioned maybe twice. It's a very small part of the whole show, but yeah, like that was something I was thinking about. I mean, I think I pitched an interview request at some point for Led Zeppelin. I don't think I heard back. So I was thinking when making it as well about, for instance, again, I spoke earlier about John Ronson being an influence, and that was probably why I brought him onto the podcast. But equally, I also thought this is a podcast that people who like John Ronson's books and podcasts would probably like, and therefore his presence on it is probably a good indicator. Same with John Sweeney. Like if you like the John Sweeney sort of confrontational panorama documentaries, you might like this. So yeah, kind of. I was thinking about it when I was guest booking, that I wanted to make something to indicate what sort of show it was. But yeah, I mean, just to kind of go back to the influencer thing, Ramesh Ranganathan. I don't know if you know Ramesh in the Netherlands, but he is maybe the most ubiquitous kind of talk show comedian at the moment. Huge following, and he's from East Grinstead, and his family owned a pub in East Grinstead, etc. So he was really a person that I really wanted to get an interview with. Had various conversations with his representatives, and it just couldn't make it happen. But that would have been something I think would have been really advantageous if he was kind of part of the product. But then it would have served absolutely no creative worth in the project. So it would have just been something I would have done solely for marketing purposes. So it's a balance.
When I listened to the main episode about the Scientologists, and you started talking about the John Sweeney interview, I was walking along thinking, he's going to play that segment, because it is so, it's so infamous around the story here in the UK and that particular investigation by Panorama. How did you go about constructing that episode and the whole narrative about Scientology, given that, as John Sweeney found out, they can be fairly itchy about how they're portrayed in anything in the mainstream media or in podcasts and stuff like that? How did you have to go through any hoops? Did you do any clearance? Did you just do it? If you had any feedback, how's that all played out?
No, it's funny. The Scientologists have actually been in many ways the most hands off of all the people that I contacted, because I sent their press office various requests for interview and never heard anything from them. And I'd written on Scientology before and spoken to people at the London Centre, and then I'd also received no backlash. And I talk about it in the episode that actually when I wrote that piece, the backlash I received was from anti-Scientology people who thought I was too soft on them, because I would say something like, it's a ridiculous religion, but they're all humans at the end of the day, something like that. And that was very much seen as like not the line that anti-Scientologists take about Scientology. And then when I did this piece, I sort of talk around Scientology quite a lot. There was a centerpiece interview with someone who'd left Scientology locally, and I kind of wanted to leave as much of that to kind of allow her to tell her own story as possible. And then I sort of talk around the kind of history of it, and I sort of agonize about the presentation of Scientology, and I talk about Tony Ortega and the response I got, and I talk about John Sweeney and his problems. But it wasn't designed to be a sort of Louis Theroux style a walk amongst the Scientologists. And and I also think it probably helps that Scientology in the UK has diminished to such an extent as it has now, that it's almost a kind of husk of what once was. When John Sweeney went out to California for that, he was going right into the kind of the viper's nest, but it's never been the same in the UK, and it's certainly not the same now. So, but then I went and filmed a little short TV segment about East Grinstead a couple of months ago, and we went to St. Hill. We did a kind of to-camera shot outside St. Hill at the gates, because you can't get any closer. And then as we were kind of walking back to where we parked the car, kind of a guy on a quad bike kind of rolls up next to us and says, "Hi there, I saw you filming. Is there anything we can help you? I could be your guide around town." And we were like, "Oh, all right, mate. No, we're fine. Thank you very much. This is normal." So there's still a kind of element of it, but yeah, I think the fact that I wasn't doing like digging into the secrets of Scientology really it probably helped. But I don't know. I also think John Sweeney had a really bad experience with the Scientologists. There is maybe a tendency to slightly hyperbolize on some people's parts because it makes a more dramatic story. But I don't know.
Overall, how do you think East Grinstead comes out of your podcast reputation wise?
Pretty good, I think. I don't think I've damaged the reputation. I think it's I've tried to show it's an interesting town, and I've tried to show it has this interesting history, and I don't think I made a sort of carnival of them. I think it's probably been a net good for the town, but it's not been a particularly big thing for them. I think they're used to these cycles of interest in the town. You know, the documentary that was made in the 90s. You know, it's kind of a recurring theme that every few years the Mail or the Sun produces a big splash on being like this freak show town in Sussex. So they're kind of used to this cyclical interest. But you know, it's always reassuring when you hear people be like, I didn't realize about, you know, the guinea pigs, or I didn't realize about the nuns, or, you know, I didn't know anything about Piltdown or whatever. You know, there's all this other history as well to it that this podcast goes into, and I think a lot of that was probably new to people. So that's, I think, a good thing.
Getting to that final episode, which, as I said, was really terrific. Did you have a sense as you were building it that was where it was all kind of leading to? And for those that haven't listened to it yet, you know, you kind of bring all the themes together almost, and then you start talking about confirmation bias and things like that, which I just thought was a really interesting way of kind of summarizing it all and exploring some slightly even deeper issues, if that's the way of putting it.
I knew where I wanted to go. I knew kind of what my thesis was, because I sort of felt you have to tackle this question of why East Grinstead. It's kind of it's the question that kind of, I think, the whole subject begs is why have all these things happened in this single town. So I knew roughly where I wanted to go, but I had sort of thought, I'll just write something. I'll just have that final episode will be just basically monologue. And then I'll intersperse, you know, I'd asked a lot of my interviewees throughout the process, I'd asked them a variant of this question. I thought I'll intersperse their views with kind of a longer thing of my own, and I basically won't do any new reporting on this. And then, you know, a couple of days before the episode was due to come out, I was like, this isn't working at all for me. I just don't have the material. I don't want the final episode to be just so slight. And so I kind of, I had previously exchanged emails with the psychologist who invented the term, the Baader-Meinhof syndrome, confirmation bias. And he's really old, and he got COVID, and he was like, I'm dying or something. He told me that he was about to, you know, I don't think he has died, but he basically said, I can't do it because I'm on my deathbed. And so I'd sort of forgotten about that. And then, yeah, as I say, a couple of days before I was due to release this final episode, when the rest of the series was out in the world, I kind of knew that it had an audience. I was like, God, this just feels too slight. And so I did 4 extra interviews for that final episode in a couple of days before publishing, which was that Jack Valero from Opus Dei, he'd kind of got in contact with me when he heard about the podcast and said, "Oh, you know," and they were very friendly, Opus Dei, I have to say. Anyway, I thought actually I could do an interesting interview with him to be like, are Opus Dei even that interesting, and how does that fit into the story? And then I had kind of dreamt up this thesis about the country houses, and I spoke to a couple of kind of historians, politicky people, and they're more from my normal professional wheelhouse, because I do mainly current affairs. So I sort of just kind of tapped up a couple of people and knew on that. And then I was just like, I need to do something on this confirmation bias thing, because I think that's kind of where I want to end up. I basically have, for a long time, I wanted to do an interview with Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, to conclude this episode, because actually my thesis was more like the Wikipediaization of the human mind has done this. But for various reasons, that did not work out. And so I then contacted ETL Draw, and we just set something up for the next day. And he was a really funny guy, actually, really dry. I don't know to what extent that comes across, but just and kind of an amazing mind. And so then I kind of refashioned the whole episode. And I was actually, each episode came out at like 7 a.m. on a Monday, and I think I was working on that one till about 3 a.m. on Sunday. I sound tired in some of the later episodes. I sound audibly different because I was changing the narration, recording narration. And the problem was that I recorded most of the podcast in Cheltenham at my in-laws, and then I came back to South London, but I hadn't finished making all the podcast, and the whole recording environment here is totally different, and we've constantly got, you know, noise from the street and stuff like that. So I was having to get up really early to record it, but it was sounding different anyway. So I couldn't mix and match anything. I had to every time I had to start the narration over again. So yeah, I was working on that I signed off that episode, in so much as there was sign off, at about 2 or 3 a.m. on the Sunday, published it on Monday at 7 a.m. There was a factual error, which I had to correct about midday. So it was actually kind of slapdash. So I knew, to answer your question in a very long-winded way, but I knew where I was going with it. But I actually made a kind of quite radical changes in the kind of final 48 hours to how I was going to tell that story.
One of the things I noticed, whether again this is intentional or not, is that the music, both the intro and the outro music, are quite 80s, a bit kind of synth poppy. Was that deliberate?
It's deliberate.
Oh, good.
The thing that was not deliberate was that I commissioned a track, and I said, I basically had a list of influences. It was very much 80s synth pop. I wanted to sort of evoke the Stranger Things title track as a sort of marketing tool. So I commissioned someone, and then they told me that they had massive computer failures or something like that, and they couldn't do it. And I was like, don't worry at all. So I commissioned someone else. And then the person who had the massive computer failures also sent me the track. They were just like, I've done it. I managed to borrow a friend's computer, but I'd already commissioned another one. So I had two title tracks, the title track and the end credits music. And so the reason they're kind of different is because, and the reason there's two different sets of artists are credited at the end is because of an admin failure on my part. But yeah, they were both given the brief of that. I wanted it to be 80s synth, Stranger Things, Twin Peaks, that sort of thing.
So for those who haven't listened to the podcast yet, what are the ideal conditions under which they should take a listen to The Town That Didn't Stare?
I don't know. I'm the last person to ask because I haven't listened to it as a listener. I would suggest that, I think Walking the Dog is a good one. I think it's a bad podcast to listen to when commuting, purely for the technical reason that some of the recordings are not amazing quality, and I think I would struggle to hear some of the lines on the tube, because I recorded it all during lockdown, and everything was done remotely, and certain people, certain very good interviewees, like for instance Kim Sengupta, who's a veteran kind of foreign reporter, his line was awful, and there's this dowser up in the Ashdown Forest and he sounds absolutely terrible. And there was only so much restorative work I could do on those. So I would say don't listen to it on the London Underground, certainly not the Central Line. But when you're walking the dog, there's an element of the podcast that is about communion with nature. And so walking the dog is a good set of conditions to listen to it to. But I don't know.
And also, if you're like me and you did laugh out loud a couple of times, doing that on the tube is never a good thing, really, is it?
So I think to wrap up here, we'd just like to ask, what's next for you? Are you making another documentary-based podcast or a Led Zeppelin documentary, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, Led Zeppelin. Yeah, that's an idea. I'm always soliciting new ideas. I'm back to just, I guess, doing my day job for the time being. I'm sort of tentatively working on a second series of this, which is looking at a different town. So I think I've said everything there needs to be said about East Grinstead, but the idea of making a series where each season we look at a different one of kind of Britain and, maybe one day the world's most interesting towns. And I think, the fact is that I made most of this series of the podcast in Cheltenham, and Cheltenham is a really interesting town because it's where all of Britain's spies kind of live. And so if I were to guess, nothing confirmed, I would guess that the second season might be set there. And then I've got a kind of couple of other tentative projects, but it's a real balance at the moment because the day job is quite busy, and doing projects like this are great, but I have only lost money on this. I haven't made a penny. So it's been nice to be talked about and written about, but I do also need to feed my dog. So it's a balance.
Well, I'm glad that you've created this because I really enjoyed listening to it. And actually, I said to Kevin, this is probably one of the best independent podcasts I've ever heard.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So Nick Hilton of The Town That Didn't Stare, thank you for joining us on MetaPod.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
What I really like about Nick's podcast, and I guess Nick himself, Wendy, is that, there's really no grandstanding or sensationalism. I don't know if you agree, but, despite there being an obvious temptation to probably do so, given the subjects covered, unless you probably count the inclusion of the infamous ranting that we discussed with him, with the Scientologist clip and the guy from the BBC, John Sweeney, which for me is still probably a classic bit of broadcast journalism.
Yeah, I'd never heard of East Grinstead before this podcast, and I was pretty amazed. I mean, it's funny It's factual. It's asking you to think a bit, and there's even a tiny bit of Led Zeppelin.
Hooray. Anyway, right. So if you've listened to The Town That Didn't Stare already, then we hope our chat with Nick has given you an idea of what went into the creation of what I think was actually one of the best that I listened to last year.
You say that a lot, but actually, I do think the same. This was one of the best independent podcasts that I listened to last year, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess 2020, for all its worries and craziness, was also a year when I was able to kind of escape on long walks with the dog and discover so many of the terrific podcasts that we're actually now featuring on MetaPod.
That's true. And Nick did hint at wanting to continue with a series on small towns, so I'm looking forward to what he comes up with next. Until then, you can follow The Town That Didn't Stare on Twitter and Instagram. There's also plenty more to learn about The Town That Didn't Stare and its creator at Podo, the independent podcasting company founded by Nick. You can find all the links on the MetaPod webpage for this episode.
And now that we've got 4 episodes for MetaPod out in the wild, as it were, it's a good time to say thanks to a few people behind the scenes here.
Yes, absolutely. So one is the voice of MetaPod, lending a tone of sophistication to our welcome and farewell each week. That is Zoe.
Yep, and the other is Alex, who helped us get the MetaPod website up and running a few months ago. So yep, we love Alex and Zoe, so a very warm thank you to them from us.
Yes, thanks to Zoe and Alex, we have a website and a jingle, which, come to think of it, will be coming along any second now. So that's it from us for now.
Okay, and we'll see you next time.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.